Quickly, Jacob plunged his sword into the earth. Vines began to snake along the ground, wrapping themselves around the still in shock Martin and the unconscious Luke and pulling them back towards himself. At the same time, thick trees sprouted from the ground around him, catching the ceiling roof above him. He searched for Caleb with the vines as best as he could, but as far as he could tell, he was already gone. Jacob turned around and slapped Martin, causing the latter to snap back to reality. Today's story was written by Craig Madison, titled The Four Swords. I'm dressed the way I like, so it must be time for... Looking back at it, that sunrise was like this one, as all sunrises are. Martin sat on the city's ramparts, looking to the south at the tree-covered mountains before him. Today was the day he and his friends, Luke, Jacob, Bryce, and Caleb, were going to break the taboo in the now almost desolate city. The five friends were planning to leave the city and head south to the Forbidden Mountain to prove that there was nothing to worry about and that the legends surrounding the building of Bastion were all superstition. The walled city Bastion was set up over 1,000 years ago to watch over a worldwide threat to the south. The legend surrounding the building of the city claimed that a dark spirit had been sealed in the mountain by a lone warrior, and that the city stood to stop people from journeying to the mountain and thus accidentally freeing the dark spirit sealed within. Over the last 500 years, the city's population had dwindled to almost nothing due to exodus, mostly due to the belief that the so-called dark spirit did not exist. The current population consisted only of 11 people, 5 of whom were teenagers and 6 adults. Martin and his 4 friends, all of whom but Caleb were orphans, the city elder, Caleb's grandfather, Caleb's grandmother, the middle-aged nurse who ran the orphanage, 2 farmers, and a carpenter who doubled as a blacksmith. The teenagers' parents, all except for Caleb's of course, had been killed by a weird venomous type of insect that had been migrating through the area from the south. At the time, the children were about 3 years old. Starting at around 6 years old, the blacksmith and the village elder had begun training them every day for 6 hours at the old barracks, after which they would get 4 hours of education from the nurse and Caleb's grandmother. Martin chuckled at the memories of them wielding swords too big for their bodies and headed towards the south gate, the planned exit point for their expedition. He had tied his dreads into a short ponytail behind his head and began to check his supplies. For weapons, he had 10 arrows in his quiver, the maximum they were allowed at one time, his hunting knife, and a wooden longbow left behind by his forgotten father. In his pack, he had a week's worth of salted meat, dried berries, and nuts. He had 1 thick bedroll and a large fleece blanket. A freshwater stream ran alongside most of the route to the Forbidden Mountain, so he had only brought 1 canteen since he could refill it along the way. According to the description given in the legend, the cave holding the dark spirit was about a day's journey from the village. "Shouldn't you have checked your gear before you left?" came the gruff voice of Luke from the shadows. His dark skin tone had camouflaged him in the shadow of the wall. His dark brown eyes stared up the stairs to the gate at Martin, who took a step backward, startled by the sudden appearance of his friend. Luke wore dark green tunic and brown trousers, probably to help him undetected through the forest. He carried a pack slightly smaller than Martin's, but no quiver or bow, only his hunting knife. "I did check my gear beforehand," Martin replied, pausing before adding, "but you know I had to check it again to make sure." Martin continued down the stairs and sat on the last one, setting his bag, quiver, and bow beside him. He looked up at the sky, slowly turning blue and losing its purples and pinks. He had wanted to leave at twilight before the nurse did her rounds to check on them. After another 2 or 3 minutes, Jacob and Bryce came loudly into view, singing some songs about becoming great heroes. Jacob's short black hair bounced against his tan skin as they skipped, appearing to contrast Bryce's blonde hair and pale skin. Behind them, Caleb could be seen scowling, probably at the thought of singing loudly when you were supposed to be trying to be stealthy. Caleb's long black hair was braided back as usual, ending towards the middle of his back. He wore black trousers and a dark blue tunic over which he had thrown a black hooded cloak. Jacob wore a light green tunic, brown trousers, and a dark brown cloak. Bryce wore bright blue tunic and black trousers, his favorite outfit. Martin wore black trousers and a red tunic over which he had thrown a hooded black cloak with red streaks. Now that the entire group had gathered, Martin again checked his supplies and everyone else's. After providing Luke with an extra cloak and being satisfied that their supplies, the group opened the gate and headed out of their walled city towards the Forbidden Mountain and the so-called Dark Spirit. They had reached the Forbidden Mountain in 2 days. Their excitement had driven them almost twice the distance they had anticipated on their first day. Martin was especially pleased with himself, as he had more than enough supplies to make it back safely, and considering how well their journey had gone, it was doubtful that anything evil existed in their area. The 5 friends stopped outside the cave, supposedly containing the Dark Spirit, to eat and rest. They cooked fish they had caught from the stream over a fire and laughed at the idea that 5 teenagers were about to prove the adults were just superstitious and that there was nothing to be afraid of. After about 2 hours of eating and relaxing, they decided to head into the cave. Luke went in first, torch in hand, then Martin's bow drawn ready for a bear or cave lion, Jacob's sword in hand, Bryce carrying a second torch, and Caleb watching the rear, sword in hand. 15 feet in the tunnel opened into a large circular cavern about 30 feet in diameter. As the group spread out into the cave and the light from the torches cast itself upon the walls and floors, they noticed a large pillar of what appeared to be crystal in the center of the cavern, inside of which seemed to be a dark mass whose shape they could not make out. Around the crystal, at each cardinal direction, was a different ornately designed sword buried halfway up the blades into the ground. Without thought, Martin grabbed the sword directly in front of him at the north position. As he pulled it out of the ground, flame shot out of the hilt and up the length of the blade, causing Martin to drop it in surprise. Intrigued, the others began to move towards swords, curious as to what wondrous powers the others might hold. At the east position, to Martin's left, Luke grunted and yanked the sword from the ground. The blade began to glow in his hand, and he flourished it, causing electricity to shoot out of the sword and crack the cave wall to his left. Luke stared at the wall in wonder. He had never seen or imagined anything like this. To the west position, at Martin's right, Jacob pulled the sword out of the ground with a sort of grace only he could. As he raised the sword, flowers bloomed on the cave floor around him. Jacob brandished the sword, and the flower growth spread before him, stopping just short of the cave's back wall. Near the back wall of the cave, at the south position, Bryce and Caleb had each raced towards the sword, but Caleb managed to edge him out. As Caleb's hand touched the sword, an icy blast of cold wind shook the cavern, causing everyone to shiver. As he pulled the sword from the earth, Bryce noticed something was odd about his friend. The dim lighting might have been, but his friend's normally gray eyes appeared pitch-colored. Caleb motioned with the blade in Bryce's direction, and a pointed shard of ice shot from it into Bryce's chest, piercing through his heart and out through his back. Suddenly, the cave was alive with the sound of Jacob screaming, "You bastard!" as he darted towards the south position in the direction of Caleb and Bryce. Luke and Martin, who could not tell what had happened around the crystal, rushed to the southern position with swords raised. Bryce lay in a puddle of his blood near the west wall, a large, jagged chunk of ice protruding from what had led to be his chest. Jacob was attacking Caleb, who was grinning as he weaved around the blows, his eyes glowing with a darkness Martin had never seen before. Luke darted past Martin and towards the now dueling Jacob and Caleb, as Martin stood dumbfounded, sword pointed towards the ground. Caleb spun around and kicked Luke, sending him flying into the eastern wall. He then raised the blue-bladed sword and jammed the pommel hard into Jacob's left shoulder, which responded with a resounding crack. Caleb then jammed his sword into the cavern ceiling, cracking it. Ice began to form and spread along the cracks, fracturing them until the ceiling began to cave in. Quickly, Jacob plunged his sword into the earth. Vines began to snake along the ground, wrapping themselves around the still in shock Martin and the unconscious Luke and pulling them back towards himself. At the same time, thick trees sprouted from the ground around him, catching the ceiling roof above him. He searched for Caleb with the vines as best as he could, but as far as he could tell, he was already gone. Jacob turned around and slapped Martin, causing the latter to snap back to reality. "Well," Jacob asked, looking down at Martin, who was still unsure what had just transpired. Did Caleb kill Bryce?" Martin asked slowly, not sure he was exactly dreaming. He was, for example, sitting in a cave that held 4 magic swords, and one of his friends had just killed another. "Is Luke still alive?" "Yes, Luke is still alive. No, I don't think Caleb killed Bryce per se. Something about Caleb was off, almost like he was someone completely different." "Is it possible we released the dark spirit?" "If it exists." "What do we do now?" "I think the best thing would be to take Luke home and regroup." "The other citizens are going to be pretty pissed at us, but we have to tell them. Then we can decide on the best course of action." Jacob paused here. He wasn't entirely sure they would be allowed back into Bastion, assuming the now possibly possessed Caleb was not just waiting outside the cave to ambush them and finish them off. Using the glow from Martin's sword and Jacob's plants working to clear the rubble and carry Luke, they managed to reach the entrance of the cave. It was well into the night, and the gear they had left at their makeshift camp still awaited them undisturbed. Had Caleb not gone this way out? They grabbed what food they could from Caleb and Bryce's packs, carrying Luke back with them as they headed north towards Bastion, keeping an eye out for nocturnal predators and Caleb. Luke awakened on the 4th day, about halfway back to Bastion, still thinking he was embattled with the dark spirit. He sat grumpily to the side and ate his meals in silence upon discovering that Caleb had defeated him in one blow. On the 5th day, as they climbed the mountain back up to Bastion, they noticed something was wrong. Thick, dark clouds of smoke were pouring down from the mountain from the direction of the city. The smoke was thick and repugnant, so much so that the 3 stopped to vomit on more than one occasion. When they finally reached Bastion, they were horrified at what they found. The entire city inside the walls was burning. Everything was ablaze in every abandoned building. The stupid school they had despised, the barracks, the orphanage. Martin raised his sword high, and the flames began to rush off the charred remains of the building and into the glade. After Martin had quelled the fire with his sword, the group split up around the city to search for survivors, planning to meet in Bastion's center. Everywhere Martin turned was scorched and burnt. He rushed towards the blacksmith's house as fast as he could, knowing that Jacob was headed opposite him towards the orphanage, and Luke was headed past the town square to the elder's house and the farmer's. He arrived at the blacksmith's house about 10 minutes after they split, out of breath. The house was a charred ruin with nothing left but a few beams, and the front wall showed it had never existed. Out of the remains of the window hung a blackened corpse, hand outstretched towards the sky. From the golden necklace inlaid with a sapphire around the corpse's neck, he could tell it was the blacksmith. Martin removed the necklace and buried the body, placing the necklace in a pouch at his side. After this task, he headed towards the city center, hoping that the others had found survivors. Evidence of someone having escaped, or even the source of the fire. However, he suspected it would be no one other than the dark spirit-possessed Caleb. As Martin reached Bastion Center, all hope died out. In the center of the city, beneath the tree that grew at the very peak of the mountain, were Caleb's grandparents. His grandmother had been tied to a stake and burned in front of her husband, who was burned only from the neck down. The Dark Spirit had used magic to sustain the Elder so that he would be alive when they arrived, if they arrived. The Dark One heads northeast to the desert lands, spurted the Elder in pain-filled gasps and in between groans of agony. He plans to channel his energy using the old pyramid to restore his original form. He shuddered and then died. Tears streamed down Martin's face as he realized the gravity of the situation they found themselves in. They had effectively killed everyone they had ever known, gotten his best friend possessed by a dark spirit, and now even Caleb was more than likely lost to them. "I'm done," Luke said, turning away from the corpses of Caleb's grandparents and towards the setting sun. "I don't care about any of this anymore, and frankly, I never really did to start. I didn't care whether the spirit existed, and I don't know. I'm going to take this sword and head west. I'll hide out and stay out of his way. He surely won't care about any of us enough to pursue us, especially if his goal is unhindered." "And what about Caleb?" Jacob asked, placing a hand on Luke's shoulder to stop him from leaving. "He didn't exactly do any of this. It was the Dark Spirit." "We all know Caleb hates his grandfather because his parents left Bastion," said Luke, gesturing towards the bodies. "Why should the Dark Spirit treat these two special if it had nothing to do with Caleb? I don't think Caleb is redeemable. I think more than likely he's a willing participant in all of this, and even if he isn't, I don't think I'm ready to give up my life trying." And with that, he headed northwest, out of the city, fleeing Caleb as quickly as possible. Jacob turned around to Martin, who had been silent this whole time and pretty sure of the answer he would receive, and asked, "And you?" "There's no use trying to figure out if Caleb did this himself or why he did this," Martin said, shouldering his pack and wiping his eyes. "The way I see it, the only way to know for sure is to remove the Dark Spirit from Caleb and ask Caleb himself." "Well, lucky for us, I think I know how we can remove the Dark Spirit," said Jacob as he cut through the stakes, holding the bodies up and untied them before they began to bury them. After they had left Bastion, now more of a walled graveyard than a walled city, Martin and Jacob pursued Caleb northeast across the land towards the desert, hoping to stop him before the Dark Spirit could restore his original form. For months they pursued Caleb. The only signs of him were the scorched remains of the towns and the piles of corpses in his wake. The Dark Spirit never left anyone alive, man, woman, or child, and everything he touched proceeded to the afterlife regardless. Finally, about 3 months after leaving Bastion, they came upon Caleb sitting alone in the forest as if he were waiting for them. He sat on a stump in the middle of the clearing, hood pulled tightly over his head. Under his right arm was a round object wrapped in some kind of red cloth, and upon his shoulders sat the blade of ice. At his feet sat another sword, its glowing blade instantly recognizable to the pursuing duo. "Luke's sword!" shouted Martin as he pointed frantically at the blade lying at Caleb's feet. Caleb chuckled and rolled the wrapped object towards them, the chuckle building into a sinister laugh as he did so. "Luke's head!" Caleb shouted and pointed in the same manner as Martin, laughing maniacally. "The fool was in one of the towns I visited, and when he tried to run, I decided to cut him off, literally." He stopped to laugh at his joke. As he did, darkness crept from him towards Martin and Jacob, who had begun to back up in horror. Caleb grabbed the sword from his feet and began to rise into the air, pulling the ice sword from his back as he did so. "You children don't worry me, nor can you compare to a drop of my true power." Particles of hail began to form around them, crackling with electricity from the Dark Spirit's newly acquired lightning sword. Martin raised the sword into the air, felt the flames begin to form, and swung the blade as Jacob yelled, "Martin, no!" An explosion rocked the forest, sending Martin and Jacob wheeling backward. Jacob reacted quickly and pointed his sword at Martin. Vines sprung up from the tip and grabbed him as steam obscured his vision. As he pulled Martin towards him, he had roots dig up the ground and cause the grass to grow over the pocket of earth that concealed them from the Dark Spirit. Vaporize themselves, chortled the dark spirit as he continued northeast towards the desert. His final goal was to have his original body recreated. They had journeyed for several months after that, finally reaching the desert, which was a dark spirit's ultimate goal. The way forward had been stressful and tedious, pushing their bodies and minds to their limits. The two emaciated, slightly dehydrated men made their way towards the old pyramid in the center of the desert. The dark spirit had slowed, possibly due to the lack of nutrients within Caleb's body, or possibly because he was unhindered and thus unstoppable, allowing them to be within reach of stopping him. Martin just hoped the plan worked, if it could be called that, assuming the arrangement of the 4 magical swords was the key to the seal that bound the dark spirit's earlier body. Martin and Jacob planned to somehow get the swords into position and have Caleb cast the dark spirit into the necklace Martin now carried. Neither of the 2 friends expressed it out loud for fear of manifesting it, but both believed that more than likely their plan would fail. Still, they trudged forward, sustained by their resolve to fix their mistake, which now plagued the world, or maybe their resolve to save their friend. Only the 2 of them knew. At the entrance of the pyramid, they took a short rest, drinking water from a cactus plant Jacob had created using his sword. First would come the easier of the 2 tasks, removing 2 magical swords from the grip of a super powerful magical being. The hardest task of all is having a possibly dormant, if not dead, friend cast said super powerful magical being into a necklace, assuming the latter can be done. Martin steeled his nerves and raised his sword. Flames sprung into life around the blade, fueled by his resolve to face the dark spirit. Jacob removed his cloak and bag and headed into the pyramid entrance, motioning Martin to follow closely. The flames from the sword cast uneasy shadows on the walls around them, which caused the hair on the back of Martin's neck to rise. Energy seemed to pulse throughout the air all around them, humming off the walls and in their ears. The 2 had continued forward for about 20 minutes when they finally spotted the dark spirit. He was floating about 4 feet above the ground in the pyramid's center, eyes closed, arms outstretched to the sides. Dark energy appeared to be condensing at his feet, but it was the shapeless cloud of black smoke at the moment. Jacob and Martin inched forward slowly, moving towards the dark cloud and Caleb. They split to opposite sides as they got within 10 feet of him, hoping to pin him down with a coordinated pincer attack. When they were about 5 feet from him, they noticed the ice sword and the lightning sword lying on the ground behind the still growing mass of dark energy that previously obscured the swords from view. Jacob motioned for Martin to hold off the attack and stretched his sword toward the 2 blades. 2 thinner vines snaked from the tip of Jacob's sword towards the 2 blades. As the vines were pulling the swords back across the ground, because they were too heavy to be lifted by the vines, which Jacob had used to avoid the dark spirit's notice, the ice sword snagged in a crack on the floor stones and made a loud clanking sound as it smacked into it. The dark spirit opened one eye and growled, annoyed by the sight of the 2 teenagers before him. Why would children have pursued him this far? Why would they think they could defeat him? Persistent brats, yelled the dark spirit as Jacob sprang into action, grabbing the lightning sword and slamming it into position. The dark spirit pointed and black bolts of energy shot through the air toward Jacob, who was already moving to grab the ice sword. The bolts narrowly missed Jacob as he grabbed the sword, pushed forward by large tree trunks he had sprouted from the ground. As he moved to the second position, vines sprung out of the pyramid floor and up towards the dark spirit, wrapping around his legs and then up his torso and around his arms. Recognizing this as the signal for their pincer attack, Martin shot flames from his sword, which engulfed both the vines and the dark spirit. The cloud of darkness, still growing, rushed upwards and encased the burning mass. Seconds later, it dropped back to its original position, still growing, but now covered in a sinister purple flame. The dark spirit hovered in the air, unharmed and unamused, glaring down at Martin and Jacob. Black feathered wings sprung from Caleb's back in a shower of feathers which rained over the duo like a drizzle. Jacob stabbed the ice sword into the floor and then circled opposite Martin, who was in the third position. to the final position. The dark spirit shouted something in a language mortals cannot understand, and the pyramid shell around them went flying, exposing them to the pre-dawn twilight. Martin shot more flames into the air, but the dark spirit flapped his wings, and they disappeared. Jacob motioned with his sword. A large tree sprung out of the ground behind him at the dark spirit, who just pointed his finger. A minuscule black orb shot from his finger, and as it touched the tree splintered into tens of thousands of pieces. Shards and splinters rained around them as the dark spirit raised his hand again. Tendrils shot out of the growing mass of dark energy, covered in the sinister purple flames. They hit Jacob in his abdomen and shoulder and then branched out, spiking out to various parts of his body violently. Jacob shuddered fiercely then, summoning the last of his will, shoved the plant sword into the now destroyed pyramid's floor as he crumbled into ashes. Martin saw this and slammed the fire sword into the ground, hopefully recreating the seal they had destroyed. "Any last words?" the dark spirit asked. He had moved faster than Martin could react, and was in his face faster than Martin's heart could beat. The sapphire in the necklace was heavy against his breast. It felt like it was keeping him from breathing. The pressure, if he could call it that, from being next to the dark spirit was so great that it felt as if his soul might collapse. "Are you going to let someone else kill your best friend?" asked Martin, staring directly into the dark spirit's eyes, behind them and at Caleb, trying his damnedest not to let himself fall into a helpless puddle in the dark spirit's feet. It all depended on him now. All depended on this. Another small orb of darkness began to form at the spirit's fingertip. As he reached it out towards Martin, Martin breathed deeply and smiled. He had finally made a stand. He had faced the dark spirit head on and found himself capable of facing that insurmountable force. How could he not face his death? The dark spirit paused, the orb an infinitely small distance from Martin's face. A pained look came across the body of his host as he began to shudder. The orb in his hand dissipated, and he began to step backwards slowly from Martin, who pulled the necklace off and prepared to seal the spirit when Caleb cast it out, if Caleb could, or even wanted to cast this dark spirit out. "Fight him, Caleb! Free yourself from the spirit!" shouted Martin, brandishing the blacksmith's necklace. The dark spirit howled and motioned with his left hand. The mass of dark energy suddenly stopped growing and shot tendrils towards Martin, who rolled to his right. The tendrils branched out and continued in his direction, leaving purple flames along the ground. Meanwhile, Caleb struggled inwardly with the dark spirit, mustering his spirit to force the foreign darkness out. Martin began dashing back towards Caleb as the tendrils continued lashing at him. A second set of tendrils came from behind him and pierced his side, branching through his back, torso, and left hip. Martin screamed in agony as he felt the sharp darkness pierce his flesh, felt the sear of the purple flames, lessened only by his exposure to the fire sword. The air filled with the smell of his flesh, and he vomited, almost passing out from the pain. In front of him, Caleb now floated in the air, still shaking. The dark cloud rushed back towards him, pulling itself from Martin, who began to crawl, bleeding profusely towards his friend. Darkness erupted out of Caleb and floated higher into the air, where it was hit by a beam of elemental energy from each of the four swords. The beams merged and created a sphere of light around the darkness, which shrunk and flew towards the sapphire Martin now held in the air. Caleb floated slowly down to the ground, the black wings disappearing from his back in another shower of feathers. He outstretched his arms, and energy flowed out of the swords and into him, causing him to glow with a strange light. "Caleb?" Martin asked, unsure of what exactly was unfolding in front of him. He pulled the now defunct fire sword out of the ground in case he still found himself in danger. "Did you know that a spirit needs permission to possess someone?" Caleb asked, continuing after the extended pause that felt like an age had passed. "For my permission, I received this ability to absorb energy, which I used to weaken the dark spirit to cast him out. Of course, I had to kill Bryce to prove I was capable, but I wish it had been you now." "Why, Caleb?" asked Martin, raising his sword. He was sure now that Caleb meant him harm, but he still was unsure why, or even if that mattered anymore. "Because now I can be anybody," said Caleb, flourishing with his hands. "With you dead, no one will know me, and with the power I possess now, none can oppose me." He started now towards Martin, who was barely hanging on, the color drained from his brown-skinned face as he tried to keep consciousness. Energy crackled around Caleb as he approached, condensing in his hand to form a blade made entirely of light. Martin took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. He did not have the life left in him for a fight, but one blow he could manage. It came exactly as he knew it would. Always flaunting his speed, Caleb rushed behind Martin to finish him. As his sword pierced Martin's chest, Martin's sword came sliding through Martin's back directly into Caleb's heart. Caleb coughed up blood as his sword dissipated from Martin's back. Martin removed the fire sword, if he could call it that, and wobbled to return it to its position. Caleb lay on the ground dead. Martin had completed the seal on the dark spirit and dealt with Caleb. He dragged himself over to the plant sword and propped himself up next to where Jacob had perished only minutes ago. He thought about the sunrise that had started this journey, a sunrise that led them not to disprove a myth, but to overcome it. As he was dying, he stared up into the sunrise dawning on that new day, and he thought only one thing. Looking back at it, that sunrise was like this one, and all sunrises are. The end. Hey everybody, All the Elder here. I just wanted to pop in before I get ready to shut everything down tonight in the studio. And before I did that, I just wanted to pop in and let everybody know that head over to dizzyangel.com. It's hyphenated. I honestly don't remember why I had hyphenated when I got the domain, but I did. So it's DIZZY-ANGEL.com, all lowercase. You head over there, there's a link where you can download a free copy of the book that I just read to you. There's some other stuff there too, and we would love for you to get your free copy. It's available in Mobi, EPUB, PDF, so pop on over there and grab your free copy, all right? And tell other people, please tell other people, try to entertain people and keep them going. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching the video. We really feel like it's a blessing that you spent your time with us, and we hope to see you again on our next. Thanks again. Head over to DizzyAngel.com, get yourself a book, okay? Get one of every book, right? They're free over there. Thanks.